Hi, this is Justin Colletti. You may know me from Sonic Scoop, but today I am on the Plugin Alliance channel, and in this demo and walkthrough, we're going to take a look at and a listen to a new EQ from Plugin Alliance in the Knif Audio line. This Knif Soma EQ is an exacting emulation by Brainworx of a super high-end boutique piece of analog hardware developed by Knif, the man behind all things Knif Audio. If that name, Knif sounds familiar, it's probably because this is the second plugin they've made along with Plugin Alliance. The first one was the Knifonium, a gorgeous multi-tube synthesizer, but today we're going to dive deeper into this Soma EQ. It is based on a high-end, mastering-grade, passive tube equalizer. Why is that interesting? Why are those things important? What makes this one unique? We'll talk about all that and a whole lot more and listen to it in action, starting right now. All right, let's dive in and start taking a closer look at this Knif Soma EQ. The actual operation of this thing is pretty straightforward, and we'll get into that in just a second. But before I do, I want to tell you about some of the unique features here. Just a quick refresher first, in case you're not super familiar with the concept of a passive EQ. This type of EQ has been loved for decades upon decades, particularly for mastering applications, mix bus applications, and for general tonal reshaping. The idea with a passive EQ is it works a little bit differently than active EQs. You can both boost and cut on a passive EQ, but under the hood, something interesting is going on. In a passive EQ, even when you're boosting the EQ itself under the hood is actually just doing cuts. So if you were to try to boost, say, 3K, what's actually happening under the hood is that everything except for 3K is getting turned down. And then the EQ at the end brings up the gain. So it sounds like a 3K boost. But this kind of process that's going on under the hood of an old school analog EQ like this one lends itself to wider filter shapes and kind of artifact-free EQing that people have loved for ages. Some classic examples of passive tube equalizers would be things like the Pultec EQs, which are some of the most famous EQs in history. In more recent years, the Manly Massive Passive is another tube passive EQ that people have loved for mastering applications. But there are a couple of things that make this Knif Soma a little bit unique in the world of passive tube EQs and arguably better for applications like mastering. So let's talk about those right now. The two, I think, most unique features here for a tube passive EQ are, one, it has something called real Q adjustment. With most passive tube equalizers, if you were to set a particular EQ boost and then change your bandwidth control to make it wider or more narrow, you'd actually end up changing the amount of boost or cut you're doing. And as you go to a wider and wider bandwidth, as 2.5 or 3 dB boost, all of a sudden isn't that much of a boost anymore. The real Q adjustment that Knif designed, I think, is the first time this has ever been put into practice in a tube hardware analog EQ, and it makes the EQ adjustments much more precise. It's much more of a what you see is what you get kind of thing. So changing the bandwidth on the bandwidth selector here isn't going to change the amount of boost or cut that you dialed in. So that's feature number one, I think, that really separates it from other EQs in its category. The other cool thing here is that by default, it doesn't have quite as much analog saturation as some of those old school EQs like Pultecs and things, which can sometimes be a little bit much, particularly for mastering, making them the kind of thing where you put them on and if it's not right for the mix, you kind of got to turn it off and use another EQ. But the very cool thing about the Knif Soma is that Knif designed it so that it would just have a little bit less saturation, a little bit less of that kind of analog idiosyncrasy when you have it set pretty flat. And a great thing you can do in plugin form is, if you want to, you can drive it even more with this headroom control or drive it a little bit less to make it even dirtier or even cleaner. More on that in a minute. Let's go through all the controls on this thing so you know how to use it, and then we'll listen to it on some actual audio examples. I've got a great track here from a band called Spirits of Leo. The song is called Patience. We'll link to the band down in the show notes below. Big thanks to Ryan Phillips for sending it over. He did some great work on this one. But for right now, let's just take a closer look at these controls. All right, pretty straightforward, pretty simple and easy to use. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bands of EQ per channel, both left and right. And we can change it from left-right mode to a mid-side mode with a simple flick of this MS switch. More on a couple of interesting and unique features on the mid-side mode in just a second. One of the cool things here is each band can be turned on or off independently. And every single one of these bands can be set from a wide bandwidth to a relatively narrow bandwidth to a shelf. So these two lower bands can turn into low shelves, and these two higher bands can turn into high shelves. We've got 16 frequency points for each band, going all the way from a low of 27 hertz all the way up to 470 hertz on this low band, and then all the way up to this high band that goes from 1.5K all the way up to 27K. There's also a high-pass filter here with some frequency points specifically curated for mastering, 25, 33, and 50 hertz. And in addition to having a high-pass filter, there's also a low-pass or high-cut filter that can roll off a little bit of your signal above 24K, above 20K, or above 17K to slightly soften the top end just a little bit. In addition to these, if I take this out of stereo link mode, we can mute either channel to hear just the left or right, or if you have it in mid-side mode, will allow you to hear just the mids or just the sides, which is super helpful. There's also this EQ in and out button, which allows you to bypass either or both bands of EQ. So you can hear just what's going on with a little bit of saturation and color that the Soma can add if you're driving its input stage harder. More on that in just a sec. There's one thing I do want to look at in this mid-side mode that I think is particularly interesting, and that is there's another way of running the high-pass filters. You can probably see right here that we can switch between either this relatively steep 12 dB per octave slope or a somewhat more gentle 6 dB per octave slope for our high-pass filter. But you might notice when I flick this switch, our EQ points change. So if I go for this gentler 6 dB per octave low cut or high pass, all of a sudden we get slightly higher high pass frequencies to choose from. This is especially useful if you take it out of link mode, have it in mid-side mode, because what this is going to allow you to do is take a little bit more low end out of the sides and take just a tiny bit of low end or none at all out of the mids. And this is one way to make the center of your mix sound even more solid, particularly in the low frequencies. By getting rid of some of the extreme lows in the sides, keeping them in the center, it just makes things like kicks and bass and other low-end sources sound even more focused, even more straight down the middle of your mix. So it's kind of another way of doing the mono maker kind of thing that you'll find built in to a lot of Plug-in Alliance plugins with perhaps a slightly different character and effect. The other thing that I want to show you here is this bottom section that includes some controls not found in the original hardware. We've got this TMT section here on the left-hand side, and by default, each channel is emulating a different specific channel of a Knif Audio Soma. In real analog hardware, there are subtle variations from channel to channel that end up giving things a little bit more depth, potentially a little bit more width. And the patented TMT technology you'll find in so many Plug-in Alliance plugins models those differences at a component level. There's more than just these two channels modeled. The Knif Audio Soma actually models, I believe, 20 unique channels. And you can also select a random set of channels right here. Or you can just put the thing in digital mode where the two channels are identical. A super useful feature for mastering applications is the mono maker that you'll find in so many Plug-in Alliance plugins that allows us to center low frequencies and add or even subtract stereo width from higher frequencies. Last but not least, over here on the right is this gain staging section. And for me, the centerpiece of this section is the headroom control. By turning it to the left counterclockwise, you can reduce the headroom in the EQ, getting us some more analog saturation and color and character, if that's what we want out of the Soma EQ. Or turning it clockwise over to the right, we can give it more headroom, making sure that we get less of that analog color and character, so we're really just hearing the changes in EQ curves alone. You can do similar things or drive it even harder by cranking up the input gain and reducing the output gain, or vice versa, bringing up the output and bringing down the input to change how much you're driving each of these gain stages within the Soma EQ. Well, that's it for the actual controls on the Knif Audio Soma EQ. Really simple, straightforward, easy to use, and the real beauty is in how an EQ like this sounds. So let's hear it on an actual track here in a mastering application. I've got this track here called Patience from a band called Spirits of Leo. Thanks again to Ryan Phillips for sending this track over. Really nicely done mix. This is a band that's kind of in the spirit of classic indie rock and shoegaze bands like The Cure and Cocteau Twins and My Bloody Valentine. And when we were listening for more modern references to find out exactly which way to go with the master that we did on this track, names like M83 and Drab Majesty were some of the records I was listening to get my ear in tune with how a record like this should sound. So let's go ahead and start listening to it. And as we do, I'm just going to dial in some quick settings similar to what I did on the master for this track in real time. On this particular master, we wanted to tighten up the low mids a little bit more and just bring out a little bit more presence in the upper mids. Let's go ahead and hear it. All right, I feel like that's starting to go in the right direction, but I actually want to take some of those beautiful wide pan guitars and just tuck them in a little bit. So I'm going to use this mono maker and stereo width control just to give us a little bit more center focus. Let's listen to that same section again. Cool, definitely sounding a little bit more like a finished record here. And in this particular mix, I'm actually doing a whole bunch of little low mid cuts that are all kind of close to each other. And this is one of the things that's kind of fun about a passive EQ is they often take well to little boosts and cuts that are happening close to one another and can kind of make new and unexpected frequency curves. We're losing a little bit of level here as I'm doing these cuts, so I'm trying to compensate with the output gain to get it kind of close to level matched. But even with the same level on the meters, the new one sounds just a little bit louder because it sounds a little bit brighter, which is one of the secrets to loudness in mastering. All right, another thing I want to take a look at here is this MS control. Let's take this thing out of link mode, put it into MS, and play around with these low filters. That's pretty cool. I'm actually starting to do a little bit of a low frequency boost here in the mids with a little bit of a gentle roll off in the sides. And I think you hear the bottom end come to slightly more focus, slightly more center if you're on a good set of speakers. Let's hear the same thing in a slightly more sparse section where we hear the kick drum in a little more isolation. So just a little bit more focus in the middle by using these additional high and low pass controls in conjunction with a little bit of low boost. Now, I actually didn't do much low boosting or cutting in the actual master that I did of this song. There's a little bit more about reshaping the mid-range just slightly, but just so we can hear the gorgeous low and high frequency shelves on this EQ, let's spin it back and just play around with those so we can hear them in isolation. I'll take it into mid-side mode and we'll just play with the lows and highs in the mid-band. So really musical and beautiful, even at fairly extreme settings, which is another one of the reasons a lot of people really love passive EQs for mastering applications. Also, when I was starting to boost some of the low frequencies here, I started to hear a little bit of that breakup character of the Soma. I'm going from this EQ into a limiter afterwards, so that's helping us control some of the changes in volume we might ordinarily expect with some really extreme EQ settings like this. But aside from a little touch of limiting at the end, we're just hearing the Soma EQ. We could even take this EQ into bypass and just play around with boosting the input gain, pulling back the output gain, playing around with the headroom to see if we can get a little bit of extra saturation out of it. Let's play around with these controls on the bottom for just a minute. So we can decide just how much of that little bit of extra graininess and grit we want to add in. One more thing here that's super fun if you've never played around with it is the auto listen feature. If we take it into auto listen, it allows us to effectively solo any one of these EQ bands to allow us to hear exactly what we're doing. For example, well, I hope you've enjoyed walking through and listening to this Knif Soma EQ along with me. I found that in my playing around with it, it was hard to make it sound bad. And that's one of the things that so many people love about passive tube equalizers, is that you can do some fairly significant reshaping without having much in the way of detrimental effects. And it's improved upon even further with the Soma EQ with this real cue adjustment feature, making passive tube EQs even more precise than they have been in the past and even more suited to modern mastering. The best way to hear this thing, of course, is to hear it for yourself on your own tracks. And the best way to do that, just go over to plugin-alliance.com where you can try this or any other plugin they make for free for 2 weeks. And if you're already a subscriber of the Mega Subscription Bundle, this is just yet another tool that is added in at no additional charge to your ongoing Plugin Alliance Mega Subscription. I hope you enjoy playing around with it just as much as I have. Let us know in the comments down below, what are you finding this EQ best suited for? What are you liking about this? What do you like about the idea of passive and tube-based EQ designs in general? I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback on it. Thanks again for joining us. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, this time on the Plugin Alliance channel. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.